Okay, so good evening everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk to you tonight. So what I'm going to do for the next 35 minutes or so is really take you on a journey showing you the scientific evidence that's occurred over the last 5 to 8 years and how we ended up with recommendations for the prevention of depression in this instance in what I'm going to focus on in terms of mental health. So in 2017, that we had really the first recommendations for the prevention of depression using nutrition. And what I want to do is really take you and walk you through the evidence of how we ended up there in 2017 and show you the wealth of evidence that was used by scientists to try develop these recommendations. And then at the end of it, what I'm going to do is focus a little bit on some ongoing work that me and my team do here in UCD. And it goes without saying, if I'm going too fast through any of this or anything is not clear, do put your hand up and stop me. I'm more than happy to be interrupted and to make anything clear that I have said that's not very clear. So when we're thinking about scientific evidence, we gather it from a number of different areas. And we really use this pyramid, which if you've been here before at these lectures, you'll have seen this before. And what we do is we have a range of different types of evidence that we used to build our recommendations at the end. So if you start at the bottom of this pyramid, what we have are lower quality evidence. So this could be, for example, me indicating my expert opinion on something and saying that I think something is important. This is of a low quality of evidence, and it's a high risk of bias because it is my opinion. So as you move up this pyramid, you get much more concrete evidence. So you get a higher quality of evidence and you have a lower risk of bias as well. So if you look in the center here, we have what we call observational studies. And these are cohort studies, case-controlled studies and cross-sectional studies. And all of these types of studies look at the association between diet or dietary patterns, and in the case of today's talk, the risk of depression. So what we're looking at here is studies that show there's a link between diet, dietary components, and risk of depression. Of course, these types of studies are of higher quality down here, but they're of lower quality than randomized controlled trials. And that's because there are certain issues with observational studies. So for example, it's very hard to understand the causal effect. So you might see a relationship between diet and dietary patterns and risk of depression, but you can't say that that risk of depression is caused by that dietary pattern. So it's an association. As long as you're aware of that, you can still use it as evidence and you can still use it to build your dietary recommendations. But the top level of evidence, or really the gold standard in evidence, is what we call randomized controlled trials. And these are trials where you say, okay, I have a hypothesis. I have a hypothesis that a certain dietary pattern is going to improve or decrease the risk of depression. And you set out a study and you design that using a well-controlled design. So these are the types of designs or studies that are used when you're trying to show that a drug has a certain efficacy. These are difficult to do in nutrition studies, and I'll come back to that in a slide's time as well, because again we have problems when we're trying to deal with whole diets, and it's to be aware of that or to be cognizant of that is also very important. And the very top part are what we call systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And a systematic review really means that you look at all of the evidence in totality. You don't remove anything. So you look at everything, you look at and then you look at your high quality studies and you try to see what is all of the evidence telling you. And in the case of tonight's talk, I'm going to try and look at the evidence from the association between dietary patterns and risk of depression. And when you look at meta-analysis, you try join all of the data together across multiple studies to try see if there's a pattern or is there an overall effect when you combine all of these studies together. So for tonight, I'll show you some results from observational studies. They will be systematic reviews and meta-analysis of observational studies, and then I'll talk about 3 randomized controlled trials in the area that have really started to move the field forward, and I'll show you and I'll walk you through those 3 studies. So with any of this, it is important to realise that there's lots of methodological issues associated with this, and this is inherent to working with diet and inherent to working with food. And number of problems, and this explains why sometimes we have we struggle giving dietary recommendations, and we struggle in the field of nutrition. And just to show you this, to explain these to you. So the first one, it's actually very difficult to assess what people are eating. There's a number of difficulties and methodological issues associated with our current methods. And that's because we ask people what they're eating, and people will often over-report foods that they perceive to be healthy, and they'll under-report foods that they perceive to be unhealthy. However, we are making progress in this area. We're making a lot of scientific progress trying to come up with new ways of developing methods of assessing dietary intake. And my group do a lot of that work, and I'm not going to talk about that tonight, but in maybe 5 to 10 years, we will have more objective measures of assessing dietary intake. In the past, we've had focused on single nutrients or foods, and this has been now shown that probably it's not the best way to go about looking at the relationship between food and health, because we eat food in patterns. We eat whole foods and we eat dietary patterns. So now there's been a big shift to try look at dietary patterns, and in particular the relationship of dietary patterns and risk of depression. In the case of what I'm going to talk about tonight, there is a bidirectional relationship between diet and health, diet and mental health, making it even more difficult to study the relationships. And by bidirectional, I mean that when somebody has mental health issues, they usually fall into a pattern of finding it difficult to cook, finding it difficult to eat healthily, and therefore their dietary quality decreases. So when we're looking at association studies, it's often very difficult to disentangle which came first. So did the mental health issues come first, or did the poor diet quality come first? And in terms of randomized controlled trials, I said these are our gold standard. These are the top layer of evidence that we wish to have when we're talking about the relationship between diet and health. The problem with working with food is that it's very difficult to blind participants to which treatment group they're in. So if I'm working with a drug, it's very easy. The drugs look exactly the same. So the placebo group is the same as the active group. When you're trying to intervene with a whole diet, it's very difficult to mask what dietary arm you're on. And I'll talk a little bit about that and some of the things that we can do to overcome this. But this means that a lot of nutrition-based studies, and in particular whole diet studies, get a lot of criticism from the scientific community because we're not fully blinded. But we try our best, and I'll explain what I mean by that as we go through. But besides having all of these issues and being aware of these issues, we have made extremely good progress in the last 5 to 8 years in the whole area. And now there is important studies that are emerging that highlight the insights between good nutrition or good dietary patterns and mental health. And there is a whole emergence of an area called nutritional psychiatry, which is looking at the interplay between nutrition and mental health. And I think in the next 5 to 10 years, this field is going to grow rapidly, and we're going to see lots and lots more of good scientific evidence that's going to boost our understanding of the relationship between diet and mental health. So let's get started with the evidence. So the first types of evidence I'm going to talk to you about are observational studies. So these are studies where you're looking at the relationship between what people are eating, so their dietary patterns, and their mental health. The first one was published in 2014. It was a systematic review and a meta-analysis of dietary patterns and the risk of depression in community dwelling adults. So they scanned all of the literature, and they looked at around 3,000 papers, and they read through all of these. They looked at the quality of them. They made sure that they were looking at the correct outcomes in terms of depression and the correct outcomes in terms of diet. They ended up with 25 papers that they reviewed in the end in their systematic review. And then they performed a meta-analysis on these, so looking to see overall, if you eat a healthy dietary pattern, do you have a reduced risk of depression? Do you have no effect on your depression outcome, or have you an increased risk of depression? So essentially this is what this study is doing. From those 25, they picked 13 that had similar definitions of dietary patterns, and they looked across all of these. And what you need to focus on is this red area down at the bottom, and in particular this triangle here. So if there's no effect of the dietary pattern on the risk of depression, this triangle would be at 1. If there was an increased risk, it would be greater than 1, and if a reduced risk, it's less than 1. So what this is showing us is that a healthy dietary pattern had a reduced risk of depression overall when you take all of the studies into account. So what they concluded, or what the authors concluded, was that the higher intakes of a healthy diet, which was defined by a diet higher in fruit, vegetables, fish and whole grains, was associated with a reduced likelihood of depression. So this was one of the first papers that had looked at joining all of the studies together, all of the observational studies, and trying to come up to see what happened overall in the studies. The issue with this is that it was unable to establish causality, and of course there's lots of confounding variables that could potentially influence this study. So it's important then to see, are there other meta-analyses that find similar results? And there was another one which was looking at, in particular, the Mediterranean diet, and they looked at the outcomes stroke, cognitive impairment and depression. And again, they performed a meta-analysis on this. So what is the Mediterranean diet? Well, I like this triangle because it explains very nicely what the Mediterranean diet is. So if you look here at the bottom, a Mediterranean diet means that you're eating vegetables, fruit, olive oil, whole grains, nuts and legumes as the base of each meal every day. So that's the difference between a Mediterranean diet and what the true Mediterranean diet is. So they're forming these as the base of all meals based on these foods. They consume fish and seafood at least twice a week. Poultry, eggs and dairy are consumed in moderate amounts, and they limit low levels of red meat and sweets and confectionery. They have red wine in moderation and at least 8 cups of water a day. In conjunction with this dietary pattern, a Mediterranean diet is also a lifestyle. So they're quite active, but importantly, they sit around a table and they eat food together. So it's celebration of food, often it's what occurs when people live in the Mediterranean countries. So what these authors asked was adhering to a Mediterranean style diet, did it have a protective effect in terms of the risk of depression? And again, you can see it here. These are all the studies that they used, and if you zoom in down here, this is the overall effect of combining all of those studies together. And what you see again here in this diamond is that the odds ratio was 0.7, which means that you had a reduced risk of depression if you adhered to a Mediterranean style diet. That's in the depression. If you look at what happened in stroke, it was very similar. Sorry, what I showed you first was stroke. Depression is over here. It's very similar odds ratio. And also for cognitive decline, they saw a Mediterranean diet was protective against cognitive decline. So what the authors concluded was that adherence to a Mediterranean diet was inversely associated with stroke, cognitive impairment and depression. So again, this was the second meta-analysis that had combined studies that was available in the literature. We're starting to see a trend here where you're seeing that increased consumption of a healthy dietary pattern was associated with reduced risk of depression. So then in 2017, there was the next study which was performed, which again was a meta-analysis. And they looked at dietary patterns and depression risk. And again, this was an update of the 2014-2015 studies. And what they found using a larger range of studies, so now you're starting to see a greater number of studies being presented here. And again, if you look down, yes?
What country was
So this is taking...
international?
Yeah, they're all international. So this one in particular is international. It was formed by a Chinese group, but the studies come from all over the world. They're a whole age range and a diverse population group. So that's also very important to realise that it's not just one population group.
Asian names there, I thought.
Yeah, but they're collecting the studies that have been published in the literature. So again, you can see here that this diamond is less than 1, and it's significantly less than 1 with an odds ratio in this instance of 0.6, showing that the adherence to a healthy dietary pattern reduced the risk of depression. So what can we conclude from all of these observational studies and meta-analysis? Well, many studies are now reporting associations between adherence to the healthy dietary pattern and reduced risk or reduced likelihood of mental health disturbances, and I've shown you the evidence from a point of view of depression. The key point is, just as I pointed out, that it's emerging from a large age range and diverse cultures and population groups. So it wasn't just in one population group. This was the evidence that was emerging from around the world in a large age range. Importantly, the evidence was emerging from studies that used a range of different methods to assess dietary intake. So it wasn't biased by any of the inherent biases we have in how we assess dietary intake, or for that instance, in how we measure mental health. So no matter what way you measured diet or what way you assessed mental health, these studies were showing that still the same outcome was happening, that you were getting a reduced risk of depression with an adherence to a healthier diet. So if we go back then to our pyramid of evidence, so down here I had that this is the lower level of evidence. As you move up, you have a higher level of evidence and you have a lower risk of bias. So what I've just shown you is evidence from this part here, which are our association studies. So you're looking at diet and you're seeing that diet is associated with a reduced risk of depression. What we want now is to look at these randomized controlled trials and see what happens when you try to do a randomized controlled trial. Is it successful or not? Well, there are really two main randomized controlled trials in the field that have really changed how we're thinking, or have really provided the really strong scientific evidence. And there are two trials that were performed in Australia, and then there's a third trial that wasn't set out to look at depression but did look at depression. So I'm going to walk you through those three trials. So the first trial is a trial called SMILES, and it was a randomized controlled trial for dietary improvement for adults with major depression. So this was seeing whether you add on a dietary intervention as an adjunct therapy, will they improve their depression symptoms. So what did they do? They done a 12-week study with a parallel group design, and what that means is they had two groups. One was the diet group and one was the control group. And in the diet group, they had 7 individual counselling sessions with a dietitian that took them through their diet and showed them how to improve their diet or how to change it towards a Mediterranean style diet. And they received the foods at home. They were delivered to their house so that they could incorporate them into their diet. The control group in this instance was what they called a social support group. So they were assigned a person as well. They came into the study centres and they got the exact same contact as the people in the individualised counselling. So the contact hours weren't different, but what was different is that they received the advice on how to change their diet. The primary outcome were depression symptoms assessed using the Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale, and what the hypothesis was that you would have a reduced depression symptoms in the dietary group compared to the control group. And this control group was what they called the social support group. So what did they do in the diet group? So they asked these Australian people to try shift their diet towards a Mediterranean diet, and they called it a Modi-Med diet, so a modified Mediterranean diet. So they asked them to increase their vegetable, fruit, whole grain, oily fish, olive oil, legume and nut consumption. But they allowed them moderate consumption of red meat and dairy, and that was to make sure that they weren't changing drastically and to try fit the Mediterranean style diet into the dietary lifestyle in Australia. So as I said, what they were trying to do was to see if this group would have reduced symptoms in the depression scale. And it's shown here in this very busy slide. So if you look up here, these are the symptoms. This is the baseline value in the dietary group and after 12 weeks. And you can see that the score went from 26 down to 14. So a very significant decrease in the symptoms in these adults who were severely depressed at the time. And here you have the social support group, and there was no change in the group. So this is all statistically significant. When you look down here, you can see the change in their diet. So they really improved their dietary quality. So they shifted to an improvement in terms of the adherence to the Mediterranean diet, whereas the social support group did not change their diet. So what can we conclude from that? Well, the results really provide evidence for that you can improve the depression symptoms of adults, and that you can actually, more importantly, you can actually work with individuals to try improve their dietary intake, and it's completely feasible. What these group also done was they modelled the cost of the diet at baseline that the individuals were eating, and they modelled the cost of the new modified Mediterranean diet. And actually they were spending less money in the modelling on the new modified diet than what they had been previously doing. So it was a cost-effective method as well. So it wasn't that it was going to cost huge amounts to shift their dietary intake. And that was very important, and since then they've went on to model and include the economic benefit of improving the symptoms, and it's hugely benefited in terms of days lost in work, etc., etc. So so from that point of view, it is extremely positive result, but there are negatives, and it is important to realise that as well. The sample size was small. It was only 34 individuals in each group, so this is a modest study. And again, this would need to be replicated in a larger sample size. The criticism that this trial received from people in the medical profession would be, again, that it wasn't possible to blind participants in the trial. So the people in the dietary group, they knew they were in the dietary group because they were getting delivered to their house hampers of food every fortnight, because they wanted them to increase their consumption of foods and to increase the olive oil. So the group allocation was not blinded, and this is inherently a problem. But they tried their best in the social group to increase the activity in the social group, to make sure that they were in constant contact with the social group as well, to try and minimise that expectation of allocation bias in the trial. So what you can conclude from this SMILE study is that following 12 weeks there was significantly greater improvement in depression scores in the dietary support group. And just to remind you again what foods were involved in that. They were foods, vegetables, fruit, whole grains, oily fish, olive oil and nuts. And they did allow moderate consumption of red meat and dairy. Now this study was picked up by a GP in the UK called the Food Medic, and she has a great number of fantastic blogs, and she talks a lot about diet and promotes very evidence-based diet. And she put this cartoon up, which I like a lot, which very simply depicts the outcome of the SMILES trial. So you had two groups, the dietary support group and the social support group. You had 33 here, 34 here, and essentially if you look at the data, you had a 32% remission in the dietary support group and you had an 8% remission in the social group. So quite an improvement in outcomes in the dietary group. So very positive results and very strong evidence that we can start to build upon in terms of trying to develop recommendations. So what was the next study? I said there was two studies that I was going to talk about, and the second study was called Healthy Med study, and again it was performed in Australia. And here it was again a Mediterranean style intervention, but this time they actually increased their polyunsaturated fatty acids, so they're good fatty acids, using a supplement. So they had the Mediterranean diet very similar to the SMILE study, but they took a supplement with fish oils. And again, it was a randomized controlled trial, and in this case it was with people that had self-reported depression. So again, you had two groups. You had a Mediterranean diet group and a social group, and they went on the intervention for 3 months, and they followed them up in a 6 month after the trial as well. So what did the Mediterranean diet group get? Well, they got cooking workshops. So they came into the facility in the university and they were taught how to cook and how to incorporate Mediterranean-style diet into their daily lives. And they also got fortnightly hampers with the fish oil and supplements included in them. The social group, they had social workshops, so exactly the same number of workshops as the cooking group to try make sure that it wasn't biased in that sense. And during those workshops, they played games, they read books, they talked about movies, etc. And these individuals received vouchers to go to the movies to try compensate for the fact that these were receiving fortnightly hampers with food. And these completed personality questionnaires so that they were, instead of the dietary questionnaires which this group were completing. So they tried to balance as much as you could in a whole diet scenario, the two groups, so there wasn't any bias between the two groups. So what did they find? Well, the first thing they found was that the Mediterranean diet group, so this MED group here, improved their Mediterranean diet, their adherence to a Mediterranean diet, as you would see. So this is a representation of their score of their Mediterranean diet, whereas the social group remained the same at baseline in blue and 3 months later in green. So did it have an effect on their depression symptoms? You can see this here. These are the depression scores. This is at baseline and this is at 3 months. So there was a 45% reduction in the Mediterranean diet group on the depression scores. So quite a significant effect here. And over here you have the social group again, where you can see that there was a reduction on that social interaction with the group, but not nearly as significant as what happened in the Mediterranean diet group. So again, very similar result to the SMILES trial, carried out in a different population. These were not severely depressed individuals like in the SMILES group, but yet you were still getting a very big improvement on their depression scores. So then the third trial I'm going to talk about is a big trial which is called the Predimed trial. So this trial was not set out to look at depression or mental health. The primary outcome of this trial was cardiovascular health, and it was performed in Spain, and it's probably one of the largest worldwide trials that's been done in terms of a dietary intervention. So they recruited 8,000, nearly 8,700, so nearly 9,000 individuals in Spain, and they randomized them to 3 different groups. So to a control group, a Mediterranean diet group supplemented with nuts, and a Mediterranean diet group supplemented with extra virgin olive oil. Their primary outcome, as I said, was cardiovascular health, but they also looked at depression and depression rates in the 3 different groups, and that's what I'm going to pull out here. So they followed up the individuals for 3 years, and then they ended up with their final sample of around 1,500 individuals in each group. So what do they find? So if you take the control group and you just have that as your reference group, and you look at what happened in the Mediterranean diet supplemented with extra virgin olive oil and the Mediterranean diet supplemented with nuts. If you look at the full group, there was a tendency towards a prevention of depression in the Mediterranean supplement, in the Mediterranean diet groups. However, it didn't reach significance. And that's because the study was probably underpowered, or the primary outcome wasn't depression in this instance. However, if you start to look down at the individuals with only diabetes, it then becomes significant. So while it's not significant with the total group, the tendency is there, and it's in agreement with what the rest of the studies I've been showing you have found. So what can we conclude from these interventions? Well, the data shows great promise for the role of nutrition in the prevention and treatment of depression. However, we will say that more studies are needed in larger population sizes to replicate these findings. So all of this data, the observational data and the randomized controlled trials, were then used to develop recommendations, and I'm going to talk you through those recommendations now. But before I do that, I just want to have one slide on emerging areas. So areas where there's not yet enough scientific evidence but are showing great promise and are very exciting. And the one that I've highlighted here is really this whole area of the gut microbiota. So an area now that we think has a major influence on our health is the area of our gut health and the interaction between the microbes in our gut and our brain. And this is what we call our gut-brain axis. So there is emerging evidence that probiotics may be a useful dietary strategy in manipulating the gut bacteria and maybe have an important role then in treatments for mental health. But as I said, most of this work is just emerging. It has been predominantly performed in animal studies, so we're really not at the stage where we would use it to develop recommendations. But again, I think in the next 5 to 10 years, this is a field that will grow and we will start to see exciting evidence coming from it. So what do we need to do then in future? So we need more randomized controlled trials to demonstrate efficacy. We need to start to understand the mechanistic impact of these different diets on mental health and what are the different pathways that are changing. The other thing that we need to do, and this has already started, is really to accept that the effect of diet on mental health is unlikely to be one food or one nutrient. It's going to be the combinations of different foods and different nutrients. And that's why most of the evidence I've shown you to date has been about dietary patterns. It's that pattern and that overall diet that is important. So if I summarise the evidence then, the dietary improvements then should only be considered to support traditional treatment methods and not to replace them. And that was in both studies I showed you, the individuals remained on their medication. So the treatments are really there to support and as adjunct therapy, not to replace therapy. The evidence is supporting the important role of a healthy diet, and the field is really emerging and is likely to grow in coming years. So a very exciting space. Now back to the recommendations. So I said in 2017 there were a group of individuals who took all of this evidence together and developed recommendations. And what they came up was these dietary recommendations for the prevention of depression. So they had a very simple approach. We're only going to take the scientific evidence that we have, predominantly what I've presented to you here, but they had 4 principles as well. And the first one was dietary recommendations should be based on substantial, although not conclusive evidence. And that's important. So I've shown you substantial evidence, but in some instances, for example, the Predimed, it wasn't so conclusive. There was a trend there, but it wasn't 100% conclusive. But it's still gathering evidence towards the recommendations. The second approach is that implementation of these dietary recommendations would be of no harm. The third approach that they had, or third idea they had, was the recommendations will be subject to modifications as the field evolves. And that's very important because this field is a very rapidly changing field. We're getting more evidence as the days, as years go on, and the recommendations will change. And that's part of science, and that's part of what we do. And finally, and very importantly, individuals with comorbidities or dietary restrictions that prevent the following of these general recommendations need to tailor the recommendations appropriate to their disease. So they need to speak to a dietitian to help them to try and incorporate these recommendations with their recommendations for their other comorbidities. So what did they come up with? Well, they have 5 very simple recommendations, and the first one is to follow a traditional dietary pattern, such as the Mediterranean diet. So that's a diet high in vegetables, fruit, legumes, olive oil, oily fish, and nuts. Or a Nordic diet. So a Nordic diet is a diet that people would follow traditionally in Norway, Sweden and Denmark, and it's very similar in its elements to a Mediterranean diet, but it just substitutes some of the foods with more local foods. So they eat much more berries, for example, and they eat much more rye and whole grains than what you would in a Mediterranean diet. Or a traditional Japanese diet. The second recommendation was increased consumption of fruit, vegetables, legumes, whole grains, nuts and seeds. And these were essential components, and they were components that you heard me repeat over and over again, either in the healthy dietary pattern or the Mediterranean diet. Include a high consumption of omega-3s, so these are what we call our good fats or polyunsaturated fatty acids. Limit your consumption of fast foods, commercial bakery goods and sweets. And then replace unhealthy foods with wholesome, nutritious foods. So these were the 5 recommendations that they came up with at the end to gathering together all of the evidence both from observational studies and randomized controlled trials. And as I said back in the slide before, this will be updated, and they are looking to update this now in 2020 to see, with the intervening evidence, can they update these recommendations. So for the last part of my talk, I'm going to just switch a little bit and tell you some of the work that we're doing here in UCD. So we are interested in mental health, and have been working with Professor David Cotter, who is a psychiatrist in Beaumont Hospital in RCSI. We've been working together for probably the last 7 or 8 years on different studies. The main study that I'll highlight tonight is a study called the ALSPAC cohort. So this is a cohort from the UK, where they followed mothers from the early 90s when they were pregnant. They took data from the individual moms when they were pregnant, and biological samples. They followed the children. They followed the children right through childhood, up into adulthood, and now the kids couldn't call them kids anymore, but they turned 24 last year. So we've been following them as well, and we're particularly interested in their metabolism and their diet throughout the lifespan. So we're asking questions like, is there anything in diet or metabolism at a very early age that can tell you whether individuals are at risk of depression at a later age? So what we've done so far is we've taken samples from the kids that are age 11, and we've measured metabolites, so these are small molecules that are circulating in your blood, and we've looked to see, is there anything, or is there any pattern here that can tell us, is there an altered metabolism that shows that these individuals are at risk of mental health disorders later in life? And by later in life, I mean, in this instance, 18 and 24. So they were assessed when they were 18 for their mental health state. So we've published 2 papers to date on this. So one back in 2017, where we did find a signature in the 13-year-olds that was predictive of those of individuals who would go on to develop later life disorders. In later life, I mean age 18. And again, we followed this up last year with a study where again we found at age 11 we could find a very distinct pattern for individuals that went on to develop psychotic disorders, or in this instance psychotic episodes. So this is very important, because now we can start to understand, is there a dysregulation in metabolism in early life, and could we find a pattern that would identify that dysregulation in metabolism, and importantly, could we use nutrition to try intervene very early to try prevent the development of the mental health disorders. So our concept here is that we use this approach to look for markers for risk factors. So we use these markers in conjunction with other markers David would use in the clinic to try identify children at very young age that could be at risk of developing mental health disorders, and then potentially intervene with them at a very early age to prevent development of those disorders. And of course, then it tries to help us understand the underlying mechanisms. And again, if we understand the underlying mechanisms, we can also get improved treatment strategies. So and nutrition will just be one of those treatment strategies. It won't be the only treatment strategies, but it will play an important role in that. So it's a very exciting project to be working on. It's multidisciplinary. Working with our colleagues in RCSI from the psychiatry point of view, and then bringing in the nutrition aspect and the metabolism aspect, and hopefully we'll have some very important treatment strategies going forward in the future. So finally then, I want to just go through a few resources that I think are useful in the area. So I put up these, and they'll be available at the end of my lecture online as well. This is from Harvard, which is a nice blog on how the relationship between food and the brain. And this is from the HSC about healthy eating for mental health. And this is a recently published book from registered dietitian Paula Mee here in Ireland. And what she's done in this book is showed about 60 to 70 different recipes of how you can try incorporate a Mediterranean diet into your normal diet, and the style of eating in a Mediterranean style. And she called the book Mood Food. And then finally, just to recommend that if you are getting any dietary advice in relation to mental health and nutrition, to really make sure that you're getting it from a qualified person. So either a registered dietitian or a registered nutritionist, and you can check up these individuals at these websites. And the reason I say this is that it's very important, of course, to get advice from the correct person, but there's also scientific literature showing that actually if you don't, then there's no benefit of the intervention. So this is, I just pulled this out from a recent study where they were looking at the impact of a dietary intervention where they had a nutrition professional involved in it. It did show significant impact in terms of anxiety. Where they did not have a nutrition qualified person in it, there was no impact. So again, showing the really importance of getting the correct advice from the correct person. So as always, when I talk, I have to acknowledge my research team. So they do some of the work I talked about at the end in UCD. Here they are. They're a wonderful group of people to work with, and I'm very privileged. And I'm privileged to be here talking to you tonight. So thank you very much for listening.